It is 1572, and the young Tsardom of Russia stands in grave peril. Torn apart by Ivan IV's reign of terror and the devastating Livonian War, it now faces a massive Tatar army sweeping down from the steppes. Crimean Khan Devlet Giray marches north with 50,000 soldiers determined to restore the Golden Horde, and with it, the Tatar yoke over Russia. The ultimate victor in the war for the steppes will be decided at Molodi, in the first ever Battle of Moscow. In 1551, Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent decided to replace the ruler of his vassal Crimean Khanate. Its current Khan, Sahib Giray, had recently refused to join the Sultan's campaign against Iran, while most of his rule was spent in power struggles and wars with the Nogai horde. Ottoman interests in the Black Sea steppes had to be guarded by someone more effective and loyal, and the Sultan had just the man he needed, Devlet Giray. While Sahib was busy campaigning in the Caucasus, Devlet seized the Crimean capital of Bakhchisarai, and with access to the Khan's treasury, quickly bought the loyalty of Crimean nobles. The takeover concluded in typical Ottoman fashion. Sahib Giray and his entire family were put to death by Devlet supporters. Now, having secured his power over Crimea, Devlet Giray could turn his attention to the real reason why he was sent to Bakhchisarai. A new power was rising in Eastern Europe, the Tsardom of Russia. Its young ruler, Ivan IV, had transformed his realm through reforms, introducing the new law code, overhauling local governance, and restructuring military service. These changes fueled rapid territorial expansion. Leading his forces personally, Ivan IV conquered Kazan in 1552 and seized Astrakhan by 1556, establishing Moscow's control over the entire Volga River basin. Russian influence spread further when the Great Nogai Horde and the Siberian Khanate became Ivan's vassals. Emboldened by his successes in the steppes, Ivan launched a war for Livonia, achieving early victories and capturing the port of Narva, finally giving Russian merchants direct access to Baltic trade routes. But while Ivan's early reign showed great promise, dark clouds were gathering over Russia. The Livonian War ground to a halt as a powerful coalition emerged, drawing Lithuania, Poland, and Sweden into the conflict against Moscow's aggressive expansion. A series of defections shattered Ivan's inner circle, none more catastrophic than the flight of Prince Andrei Kurbsky, one of the Tsar's most trusted advisors and military commanders. And when Ivan moved to root out perceived traitors, he met fierce resistance from the boyar aristocracy. Having grown up amid the overwhelming power of the boyar clans, and deeply convinced of the divine nature of his autocratic authority, Ivan believed that only absolute monarchy could preserve the Russian state. And as for the old nobility who dared oppose him, they would have to be subdued by political means or, if necessary, by force. In 1565, Ivan IV split his realm into two parallel administrations: the land, Zemshina, governed by the Boyar Duma, and the land apart, Oprichnina, territories under his direct control. The Tsar's new residence housed an alternative government and his personal guard, which he staffed with low-born gentry who had no ties to the aristocracy. These new men, oprichniki, became instruments of Ivan's reign of terror. They methodically targeted powerful noble families, seizing their ancestral lands before exiling them to eastern territories like Kazan. Over time, Oprichnina's methods grew increasingly brutal and indiscriminate. They would massacre entire noble households, from the boyars themselves down to their servants. The terror reached its height in 1570 with the infamous Novgorod massacre, where thousands perished as Oprichniki systematically tortured and executed nobles, merchants, and commoners alike. The Tsardom of Moscow was suffocating from widespread chaos, Livonian War, severe famine, and epidemics, the exact moment the old enemy of Russia had been waiting for. In May 1571, the Crimean horde descended upon Russian borders from the south. Led by a defector, the Tatars advanced along an unguarded road straight toward Moscow, crushing the Oprichnina advance regiment in their path. On May 24th, they set ablaze the undefended suburbs of Moscow. Within 3 hours, the entire city, including the Kremlin and the outlying districts, was engulfed in a devastating inferno. The destruction was immense. Gunpowder stores erupted, church bells melted and crashed down, and countless residents perished either in the flames or in their desperate flight through the city gates. Even the army suffered grievous losses, with the chief commander Belsky seeking refuge in the Kremlin only to choke from the fire heat. 3 weeks later, Ivan IV received Crimean envoys in a meeting that would underscore Russia's humiliation. Instead of the customary diplomatic gifts, the Khan's emissaries presented Ivan with a single knife, a pointed suggestion of how the Tsar should deal with such disgrace. Devlet Giray's message was unequivocal: "I burn and devastate. That is for Kazan and for Astrakhan. If you had shame and dignity, you would have come against us." According to chronicles, Ivan received the envoys wearing simple peasant clothes and a sheepskin coat while lamenting, "Behold how I am dressed. That is how the Tsar has made me. He has plundered my realm and burned my treasury. I have nothing left to give him." Yet this display only emboldened the Khan further. Devlet Giray now saw an opportunity not just for the Muslim reconquest of Kazan and Astrakhan, but for the complete restoration of Tatar yoke over Russia. Next time, Giray declared, he would go to Moscow for Tsardom. To this end, Devlet Giray assembled a formidable coalition. As a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, the Khan secured backing from the Sultan Selim II, who provided a special mission and experienced artillerymen to support the campaign. To the east, the Great Nogai horde formally broke its vassalage to Moscow, joining Giray's growing alliance. The Khan ultimately gathered a force of 40,000 Crimean cavalry, bolstered by several thousand Nogai warriors and numerous Circassian princes with their personal retinues. This was no mere raiding party. Alongside the traditional steppe cavalry, Giray mustered several hundred of his own musketeers, often mistakenly called janissaries in the sources, along with an artillery train, a clear indicator that his intention was a war of conquest. Like a bloodthirsty lion, the Tsar of Perekop came forth, roaring, opening his fierce jaws to devour Christians. Upon hearing this, our wonder fled before him 120 miles from Moscow, as far as to Novgorod the Great itself, Andrei Kurbsky noted scathingly. Indeed, by summer 1571, Ivan had established Novgorod as his temporary capital, certainly a more secure location than the devastated Moscow. Under heavy guard, the royal treasury was transported to Novgorod, with 500 Streltsy soldiers assigned to protect it each night. However, Ivan was not going to abandon Russia in its hour of need. His military commanders and state apparatus had already begun defensive preparations along Russia's southern frontier. The first line of defense began far to the south. In autumn 1571, reconnaissance units systematically burned the steppe across a vast area between Donkov and Putivl, denying potential winter and spring forage to Tatar cavalry. Meanwhile, extensive efforts went into rebuilding and fortifying the devastated capital. 7,000 masons and workers were mobilized to encircle Moscow with new earthworks and stone walls, while merchants and craftsmen were relocated from other towns to sustain the city's economic vitality. The most significant defensive works, however, were constructed along the Oka River. A sophisticated double palisade system was created on the northern bank, with the space between the walls filled with earth. Key river crossings were further strengthened with additional wooden fortifications and artillery emplacements. However, these fortifications meant little without a well-organized force to defend them. By spring 1572, between 28,000 and 32,000 Russian soldiers took positions along the Oka, including 12,000 noble cavalry, 2,000 streltsy musketeers, and 3,800 Cossacks, further augmented by armed servants and city militias. They were placed under the command of Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky, a man of strength and courage, highly skilled in military formations. Vorotynsky was an accomplished veteran of anti-Tatar warfare who had played a crucial role in the conquest of Kazan and defense against Crimean and Nogai raids. Though he had endured periods of political exile, his expertise in steppe warfare made him irreplaceable for the impending clash. Most significantly, the army witnessed an unprecedented integration of Zemshina and Oprichnina commanders, with 5 voivods from each group intermixed at various levels of command. There was to be no internal division when the survival of the state hung in the balance. With the approach of summer 1572, Devlet Giray's ambitious plans began to take shape. The Tatars advanced on Russia along the Moravsky Trail, one of several established routes that Tatar raiders used to penetrate Russian territory. The Crimean host's progress was notably slow, encumbered by their hefty baggage train and the lumbering camels that accompanied them. The Russian response, in contrast, was swift. Border voivods, leaving only small garrisons in the frontier fortresses, marched to join the main army stationed along the Oka River. By July 25th, Tatar detachments had reached Tula and burned its outskirts, though they deliberately avoided besieging the well-fortified city with its formidable artillery. Instead, they pressed their advance northward. The Tatar vanguard reached the Oka River near Serpukhov on July 26th. Their first attempt to force a crossing came at Senkin Ford, roughly 20 kilometers downstream. However, the Russian Sentry Regiment had anticipated this move and stood ready. The crossing attempt proved disastrous for the Tatars. They faced a devastating barrage of artillery fire, while Cossacks and streltsy, firing from behind fortified positions, inflicted heavy casualties. The few horsemen who managed to cross the caltrop-strewn ford were swiftly counterattacked by Russian cavalry companies and driven back into the river. This failure prompted Devlet Giray and his chief commander, Devlet Mirza, to revise their strategy. They devised a new plan, pin down the main Russian forces through sustained combat while simultaneously attempting to outflank the Serpukhov positions on both sides. To execute their new strategy, the Crimean forces split into three groups. Devlet Mirza advanced upstream. The Nogais under Teghri-Berdi Mirza moved downstream, while Devlet Giray himself maintained pressure on the central Russian position at Serpukhov. The first success came early on the morning of July 27th, when Devlet Mirza initiated a crossing west of Serpukhov, near the village of Drakino. There, he encountered the Russian right flank regiment. The engagement quickly turned disastrous for the Russians. Almost simultaneously, on the eastern flank, Teghri-Berdi Mirza's forces managed to force their way across Senkin Ford, creating a second breakthrough point. Meanwhile, Devlet Giray launched a massive artillery bombardment against the Russian central position at Serpukhov, demonstrating the significant firepower the Crimean army had brought to bear. Under Vorotynsky's command, the Russian artillery responded in kind, engaging in a sustained duel that would continue throughout the day and deep into the evening hours. Despite the threat to his flanks, the Russian commander held his ground, recognizing that the Tatar successes at the crossings were limited. Indeed, neither Devlet Mirza nor Teghri-Berdi Mirza attempted to advance further toward Moscow or strike at the Russian rear. By nightfall, as the thunderous exchange of cannon fire finally began to subside, it became clear that Devlet Giray's attempt to force the Russians from their position had failed, compelling the Khan to once again reconsider his strategy. When night fell, the Khan left behind approximately 2,000 Tatars at his original position opposite Serpukhov, along with his camp, wagon trail, and artillery. These troops were ordered to maintain the appearance of the main army's presence, while the bulk of the force marched downstream to Senkin Ford, where they began crossing to the left bank of the Oka. By dawn on July 28th, the entire force had successfully traversed the river. During the crossing, Giray dispatched Teghri-Berdi Mirza and his Nogai forces northward. Moving at an impressive pace and covering 80 kilometers in a single day, the Nogais reached the Pahra River by afternoon. There they crossed the river and spread out around Moscow, effectively cutting off all communication between Vorotynsky's army and the capital. Early on July 28th, word of the Khan's successful crossing reached Vorotynsky's headquarters. Realizing that defending the Oka was no longer relevant, Vorotynsky immediately set in pursuit of Devlet Giray, declaring, "The Khan will be more fearful this way, as we follow behind him. He must guard against Moscow while fearing us as well." The Russian army moved northward along multiple routes, maintaining battle readiness. Meanwhile, Prince Vorotynsky's vanguard regiment was tasked with shadowing the Tatars closely, seeking to draw them into a decisive engagement. Vorotynsky's vanguard regiment caught up with the Tatar rearguard at Molodi, roughly 45 kilometers from Moscow. His forces launched a sudden attack, sending the Tatar rear units fleeing in panic toward Devlet Giray's main camp. Responding decisively, Devlet Giray dispatched 12,000 Crimean and Nogai horsemen, shifting the numerical advantage in favor of the Tatars. Vorotynsky's forces began a hasty retreat. Yet having mastered Tatar tactics through decades of warfare, the Russians were now turning these strategies against their creators. As the pursuing Tatars, confident in their apparent victory, followed Vorotynsky's forces near a local hill, the Russian cavalry suddenly veered aside. The Crimean cavalry found itself exposed to devastating fire from artillery and arquebuses concealed within a mobile fortress. The barrage inflicted heavy casualties on the Tatar forces, forcing them to withdraw. Drawing upon decades of experience fighting nomadic cavalry, the Russians had developed a sophisticated mobile fortification known as the Wandering Town. Unlike traditional wagon forts, it consisted of interlocking heavy wooden shields, crafted from thick oak planks. During combat, these shields were mounted on carts and connected with hooks and loops. 3-meter gaps were deliberately maintained between sections, enabling troops to swiftly retreat behind its protective walls. At Molodi, Vorotynsky had deployed his Wandering Town atop a hill overlooking the Rozhayka River, reinforcing it with artillery emplacements and defensive trenches, transforming this position into a deadly trap for any would-be attackers. With the Russians now firmly entrenched in his rear, Devlet Giray was forced to suspend his advance on Moscow. Throughout the day, the Tatars mounted several probing attacks against the Wandering Town, testing the Russian defenses. Vorotynsky countered the enemy attacks with precisely timed sorties, sending his regiments in turns to engage the foe. That day, the battlefield was dominated by extended archery exchanges, with neither side willing to commit to a decisive engagement. As darkness fell, both sides withdrew to their respective camps. After the indecisive first day of combat, Devlet Giray found himself in a precarious situation. He could either launch a costly assault against the Russian fortifications or withdraw without achieving any of his objectives. After his earlier grandiose declarations about taking Moscow and subjugating the Russian state, a simple retreat was politically unthinkable. That night, Devlet Giray convened a war council. During the discussions, Devlet Mirza pushed for aggressive action. "I shall take the Russian camp. Once they are struck with fear and confusion, we will beat them." Following through on his boastful promise, Devlet Mirza launched his assault on the morning of July 30th. Detachments of Tatar horsemen repeatedly charged the Russian positions, unleashing storms of arrows against the defenders of the Wandering Town. Their strategy was to inflict maximum casualties, identify and exploit any weaknesses in the defensive line, break through the wooden shields, and overwhelm the Russians in close combat. Yet each assault failed to breach the fortified perimeter. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Devlet Mirza rode out with a small escort to personally inspect the Russian defenses for vulnerable points. His richly adorned armor and prestigious entourage made him an obvious target. Vorotynsky quickly dispatched a select group of horsemen from his main regiment to intercept the Tatar commander. Devlet attempted to withdraw, but his warhorse stumbled, throwing him from the saddle. The fallen commander was swiftly captured by Timur Shabayev, a baptized Tatar serving in the Russian army. The capture of Devlet Mirza sent shockwaves through the Tatar ranks, yet they quickly regrouped and launched another assault on the enemy fortifications. The Russian chroniclers noted that the Tatar attack became weaker than before. The loss of their principal commander had clearly impacted both Crimean coordination and morale. In contrast, the Russian defenders, emboldened by their earlier success, conducted increasingly aggressive sorties, inflicting heavy casualties on the attacking forces. The evening's fighting proved particularly costly for the Tatar leadership, claiming the life of Tegriberdi Mirza and resulting in the capture of an Astrakhan prince, believed to be Kazbalat. Devlet Giray's earlier decision to leave his artillery in the old camp beyond the Oka River now proved increasingly costly. Without heavy guns to breach the wooden walls of the Wandering Town, the Tatars were forced to rely on frontal assaults, resulting in mounting casualties with little tactical gain. Following the intense combat of July 30th, the battle entered a 2-day lull with only minor skirmishing. However, the defenders inside the Wandering Town, despite their previous successes, now faced an increasingly dire situation. The Russians had lost their supply trains to the numerically superior Tatar forces, who had managed to completely encircle Vorotynsky's army. Food stores within the fortress were rapidly depleting, leading to severe hunger among both soldiers and horses. Drinking water was equally scarce. Stuck on the hilltop, the Russians were cut off from the Rozhaika River. The captured Devlet Mirza, acutely aware of the Russians' predicament, boldly told Vorotynsky that if the Khan had been captured instead, he could easily free him within 5 to 6 days by simply starving out the Russians. But Devlet Giray could not afford to wait. He needed to resolve the siege quickly. Unrest spread through the Tatar ranks. Regular warriors and Mirzas alike increasingly voiced their complaints about meager spoils compared to mounting casualties. The loss of Devlet Mirza, the Khan's principal military advisor, was particularly devastating. As revealed by the captured Astrakhan prince during interrogation, "Even though I am a prince, I do not know the Khan's plans. His entire strategy is now in your hands, for you have captured Devlet Mirza, who was the mastermind of everything." Meanwhile, Tatar patrols managed to capture a courier carrying a letter from Moscow. The message, intended for Vorotynsky's camp, urged the defenders to hold without fear, as numerous Novgorod forces were supposedly marching to their relief. Under torture, the captured messenger revealed even more alarming information. He claimed that Tsar Ivan IV himself was leading the relief force, and testified that he had personally witnessed the arrival of a 40,000-strong vanguard in Moscow. Though this story was entirely fabricated, it appeared credible to the Khan given the circumstances. The prospect of being caught between Vorotynsky's fortified position and a massive relief army forced Devlet Giray's hand. On August 2nd, Devlet Giray committed all his forces to one decisive attack, with explicit orders to recover Devlet Mirza at any cost. While foot soldiers advanced directly on the fortifications, horse archers covered them with a hail of arrows. The intensity of the fighting reached new heights when Tatar warriors approached the walls of the wandering town, grasping the wooden fortifications with their hands in an attempt to dislodge them. As one chronicler vividly described, "Our Streltsy killed many Tatars there and cut off countless Tatar hands." Despite the ferocity of the Tatar assault, the Russian defenders maintained disciplined resistance. Streltsy and Cossacks poured arquebus fire into the attacking ranks, while artillery crews kept up a steady barrage of cannonballs and grape shots, inflicting devastating casualties on the densely packed attackers. Upon seeing the Tatars commit their entire force to the assault, Prince Vorotynsky prepared to execute a carefully planned counterattack. He entrusted the defense of the wandering town to Prince Vorotynsky, supported by all the artillery and a small detachment of foreign mercenaries. Meanwhile, Vorotynsky himself led the main regiment through a concealed ravine behind the fortifications. At a prearranged signal, the artillery opened a devastating barrage against the Tatar formations. Simultaneously, Vorotynsky led the forward regiment and mercenaries in a sudden frontal assault from the now opened wandering town. Just as the Tatars fully committed to meeting this threat, Vorotynsky emerged from the ravine with the main regiments, striking into the enemy's rear. The chronicles describe the ensuing combat as a great slaughter, with the Tatars caught between hammer and anvil. The defeat at Molodi proved catastrophic for the Tatar command structure. Numerous Mirzas fell in combat, crippling coordination between individual Tatar units. Facing the prospect of his army's complete destruction, Devlet Giray made the decision to abandon the campaign and withdrew on the night of August 3rd, leaving behind all equipment and supplies. The Khan's army moved with such urgency that they covered the distance to the Oka in just a few hours, immediately beginning the river crossing. To protect his retreat, Devlet Giray left behind a rearguard of 3,000 swift men to maintain contact with the Russian forces and mask his withdrawal. He positioned another 2,000 horsemen to secure the crossing points. Upon discovering the Tatar army's withdrawal, Vorotynsky launched an immediate pursuit. The Russian cavalry fell upon the Tatar rearguard, which, despite initial resistance, was almost completely destroyed. Maintaining their momentum, the Russians pursued the fleeing Tatars all the way to the Oka River, where they engaged the crossing guard. The chronicles record that the Russian voivodes killed about 1,000 Tatars there, while others escaped across the Oka. Upon returning to the abandoned Tatar camp, the Russians discovered substantial treasures left behind in the enemy's hasty retreat. The threat of a new Tatar yoke was now over. As the dust settled on the blood-soaked fields of Molodi, news of victory reached Ivan IV, who waited anxiously in prayer at Novgorod. On August 6th, the first messengers arrived bearing tangible proof of triumph: the Khan's personal trophies, including 2 quivers, 2 bows, and 2 sabers. Days later, Devlet Mirza, the battle's most valuable prisoner, was brought to Novgorod. The city erupted in celebration, with church bells ringing until midnight and services held in every church and monastery. With the immediate threat eliminated, Ivan swiftly reversed his emergency preparations. By August 30th, the state treasury had been safely transported back to Moscow, symbolically marking the end of the crisis. While celebrations still echoed through Novgorod's streets, the defeated Khan attempted to save face. Devlet Giray dispatched his envoy Giray to Moscow bearing letters that sought to reframe the devastating military disaster as a mere misunderstanding. My wish was to meet with you face to face, to speak without leaving anything unsaid. And now, if there is to be goodwill and friendship between us, and if you give me Kazan and Astrakhan, I shall be a friend to your friends and an enemy to your enemies. However, the emboldened Russian Tsar was in no mood for concessions. How can I give up Kazan and Astrakhan? Already, Crimea stands as one saber against us. And then we would face a second saber in Kazan, and a third in Astrakhan, and a fourth in Nogai? And should Lithuania refuse peace, we would face yet a fifth saber. How then could I ever yield Kazan and Astrakhan? Ivan's response reflected a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the steppes. The Battle of Molodi had decisively ended the 3-year Ottoman Crimean offensive against Russia, firmly securing Moscow's control over the Volga. Though the frontier situation remained tense, the victory's impact on border security proved long-lasting. It would be 20 years before another Tatar invasion reached Moscow's doorstep. The triumph also coincided with significant domestic reforms, as Ivan IV abolished oprichnina in 1572. While this was not a direct consequence of Molodi, the successful defense by the combined forces, in stark contrast to the previous year's oprichnina failure, likely influenced Ivan's decision. Yet, even with the Reign of Terror ended, the Tsar would maintain his draconian land policies, restricting princely estates and completely prohibiting land donations to major monasteries. In the immediate aftermath of his victory, Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky rose to unprecedented heights of power and prestige. He effectively became head of the Boyar Duma, while Ivan restored his confiscated estate and appointed him commander of the southern defenses. Yet the cynical Tsar never fully trusted his distinguished voivod. And how did he reward such loyal service? Barely a year later, he ordered this victorious defender of himself and all of Russia to be seized and brought before him in chains. This renowned conqueror, having been unjustly tortured and burned, half dead and scarcely breathing, was ordered to be transported to imprisonment at Beleozoro. He survived only 3 miles of that cruel journey before departing to his creator. The second hero of Molodi, Dmitry Hovorostynin, would survive the purges but struggle with minor appointments due to his relatively modest lineage. Even the captured Tatar commander Devlet Mirza met a grim end in Russian captivity, as Ivan, recognizing his influence among the Nogais, rejected all diplomatic attempts to secure his release. In the summer of 1577, the main adversary of Vorotynsky and his companions, Devlet Giray, passed away. The bitter struggle for control of the steppes would persist through the coming decades, but it would be carried on by a new generation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help others discover it too. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the upcoming episodes. Until next time.